They didn't even flinch. As I stood in the marble foyer of the Prescott estate, the silence was deafening, louder than any argument I had ever experienced. I had just looked them all in the eye, Isabel, Ethan, and even Alexander, and announced what I'd done. The locks had been changed, their black cards were canceled. Every luxury they once took for granted was no longer theirs to abuse. And the final blow? The family estate, the 12,000-square-foot mansion nestled in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, was now in my name, and my lawyer stood beside me with the paperwork to prove it. Still, they just stood there. No one said a word. No objections. No tears. No shouting. It was almost as if they knew they had gone too far, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. My name is Lauren Whitaker, and 3 years ago I thought I had finally found peace. After surviving a painful divorce that left me emotionally drained but determined, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I threw myself into my career as a high-end art consultant, cultivating relationships with galleries and collectors across New York. I made a name for myself in circles where connections matter, more than talent, and somehow I managed to maintain my integrity along the way. Then, during a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I met Alexander Prescott, a charismatic widower and CEO of a thriving private equity firm. He carried himself with an understated confidence that drew me in immediately. While others flaunted their wealth with gaudy displays, Alexander wore his privilege, like a well-tailored suit, elegant but comfortable. "You're the only person here actually looking at the art," he said, approaching me in front of a Monet I'd been admiring. I smiled. That's literally my job. Our conversation flowed effortlessly after that. We talked about everything except money, which was refreshing in those circles. He mentioned his children briefly, Isabel and Ethan, teenagers who were still processing the loss of their mother to cancer 3 years prior. "They're good kids," he said with a distant look in his eyes, just still finding their way through the grief. We fell in love slowly but surely. Our relationship developed over quiet dinners, long walks through Central Park, and honest conversations about our pasts. Alexander was attentive, thoughtful, and surprisingly vulnerable when we were alone. He spoke openly about his struggles raising 2 teenagers on his own while running his company. After 2 years of dating, we married in a small, tasteful ceremony in Cape Cod, with just 50 guests in attendance. The children attended but remained reserved throughout. I understood. I wasn't trying to be their new mother. I just wanted to be present, respectful, and supportive. Moving into the Prescott estate felt like stepping into a beautiful museum where I didn't quite belong. The sprawling property had been in Alexander's family for generations, every corner filled with history that wasn't mine. The staff, a house manager, cook, gardener, and housekeeper, had all been with the family since before his first wife's passing. They were polite but distant. Isabel, then 17, and Ethan, 16, maintained a cold civility in my presence. In public, they were the picture of well-mannered children of privilege. In private, their eyes rarely met mine, and conversations died when I entered rooms. "They'll warm up," Alexander assured me, kissing my forehead one night after another silent dinner. "They just need time." I believed him. I believed time would fix everything. I believed love would earn respect. But I was wrong. In the Prescott household, I was never more than a tolerated presence, a guest overstaying her welcome. The house staff followed my lead only when Alexander was around. The chef would quietly look at Isabel before accepting my dinner suggestions. Ethan never responded when I asked about school or his rowing competitions. They never looked me in the eye unless they were rolling them. Still, I smiled. I stayed. I worked hard to blend in, to help, to love. My first real wake-up call came 6 months after our wedding. I had organized a small surprise birthday dinner for Alexander at his favorite restaurant in the city. I'd arranged everything: his favorite wine, a private room, a carefully selected guests list of his closest friends. When the evening arrived, Isabel and Ethan were nowhere to be found. They had prior commitments, Alexander explained, the disappointment evident in his voice. School things. Later that night, I saw Instagram posts of them at a party in the Hamptons, laughing, carefree, clearly not at any school function. When I showed Alexander, he sighed. "I'll talk to them." But whatever conversation happened behind closed doors changed nothing. If anything, the invisible wall between us grew taller. I tried everything to bridge the gap. I respected their space. I learned their preferences. I attended Ethan's rowing competitions and Isabel's debate tournaments. I helped with college applications and listened when they had problems with friends. I never pushed, never demanded, never complained to Alexander about how they treated me. For nearly a year, I maintained this delicate dance, present but not imposing, helpful but not controlling, loving but not demanding love in return, until they humiliated me at the dinner that changed everything. The Prescott Foundation annual fundraiser was the biggest event of the year for the family, hosted in the expansive gardens of our estate. It brought together the elite of Greenwich, New York City, and beyond, all gathering to support children's education initiatives while showcasing their wealth in the process. I had spent weeks working with event planners, ensuring every detail was perfect. The garden glowed with thousands of tiny lights. Waitstaff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly in the background. Alexander had stepped away to speak with the mayor. I spotted Isabel and Ethan standing with a group of their friends near the rose garden. Wanting to be sociable, I approached them with a warm smile. "Everyone having a good time?" I asked, genuinely interested in making them feel comfortable. The group of teenagers nodded politely. I introduced myself to those I hadn't met before. That's when Isabel said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, don't worry about her. We only listen to our real mom." The words hit me like a physical blow. Laughter rippled through the group. Side glances were exchanged. Someone's champagne glass clinked against another in uncomfortable acknowledgement. I froze, my smile fixed in place. With every ounce of dignity I could muster, I excused myself gracefully and walked away. But something in me broke that night. After 3 years of patience and kindness, after countless attempts to connect, after all my efforts to respect their boundaries while still trying to create some semblance of family, this was my reward. Public humiliation at an event I had poured my heart into organizing. I maintained my composure. Throughout the evening, smiling and chatting with guests as if nothing had happened. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. That night, as I removed my jewelry and makeup in the quiet of our bedroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I had become a shadow in my own life, present but not seen, speaking but not heard, giving but never receiving. "No more," I whispered to myself. "Something has to change." I just didn't know yet how profound that change would be. The weeks following the fundraiser were worse than anything I had experienced before. The thin veneer of respect that had existed crumbled completely. Ethan began addressing me by my first name instead of the gentle Lauren or even Mrs. Prescott he had used before. He would walk into rooms and say, "Hey, Lauren," with a casual dismissiveness that made it clear I held no position of authority in his eyes. Isabel's approach was more calculated. She refused to show up for the private SAT tutor I had arranged, a favor pulled through my connections with Yale alumni, then told her father I was controlling and trying to replace their mother by forcing my educational choices on her. "I already have a plan for college," she told him coldly at dinner one evening, not even looking in my direction. "I don't need her input." Alexander, caught between his love for me and his guilt over his children, typically defaulted to placating them. "They're still grieving, Lauren," he would say, squeezing my hand reassuringly when we were alone. "Just give it time." Time. That word had lost all meaning. How much time was enough? How many years of coldness and disrespect was I expected to endure before someone, anyone, acknowledged that I deserved better? I continued my work as an art consultant, finding solace in the galleries and auction houses of New York. There, I was respected. My opinion mattered. People listened when I spoke. The contrast between my professional life and my home life became increasingly stark. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I returned home early after a client canceled our meeting. The house was quiet. Alexander was at work, the kids at school, and the staff busy with their duties in other parts of the mansion. I decided to use the rare moment of solitude to relax in the library, my favorite room in the house with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable window seat overlooking the gardens. As I approached, I heard Isabel's voice. She must have come home early, too. I was about to enter when I realized she was on the phone. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but then her words stopped me cold. "Honestly, she's just a trophy wife," Isabel was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. "She thinks she's part of this family. It's pathetic. Dad just married her because she's pretty and makes him look good at events. She's not even on the deed." I stood frozen outside the door, my hand hovering inches from the knob. The casual cruelty in her voice, The absolute certainty with which she dismissed my entire existence knocked the air from my lungs. Yeah, exactly, she continued, laughing at whatever her friend had said. She'll be gone in a year or two when Dad gets bored. They all are. Remember Christine before Mom got sick? Same thing. Christine? There had been others before me. Alexander had never mentioned anyone serious between his wife's death and our meeting. I backed away silently, retreating to my car in the garage. I drove aimlessly for hours, tears blurring my vision as I processed what I'd heard. Not just the horrible things Isabel had said about me, but the implication that I was just one in a line of women Alexander had brought into their lives. That night, I didn't cry when I finally returned home. I smiled through dinner as Isabel talked about her day, conveniently omitting her early return home. I listened as Ethan discussed his rowing team's chances at regionals. I kissed Alexander goodnight and told him I loved him. But something had fundamentally changed. That was the night I stopped hoping for acceptance. That was the night I called my lawyer. Gregory Lang had been my attorney since my divorce. He was brilliant, discreet, and brutally honest, qualities I valued now more than ever. I need to understand exactly what my legal position is in this marriage, I told him during our meeting the next day. What assets are joint? What rights do I have? What would happen if I couldn't finish the sentence? Greg's eyes softened with understanding. If things don't work out? I nodded, hating how close I was to tears. Let me look into it, he promised. We'll figure out where you stand. What Greg discovered over the next few weeks shocked us both. It turns out, Alexander Prescott was careless with paperwork. As part of our prenup and estate planning, he had signed several assets into our joint trust, including the mansion. And by a quiet but legal amendment made 6 months prior, after a health scare he had in Aspen, I had full discretion to control the trust until further notice. Let me get this straight, I said, staring at the documents Greg had spread across his desk. The house is technically mine to control? Not just the house, Greg clarified, pointing to various highlighted sections. The trust includes the primary residence, the vacation properties, and several of the accounts that fund the household operations. According to this amendment Alexander signed, you have executive authority over these assets. Why? Would he do that? Greg shrugged. The amendment was made right after his hospitalization in Aspen. My guess? He was worried about his health and wanted to ensure someone could manage things if he was incapacitated. It's actually quite common. I sat back, processing this information. The cards linked to their spending, connected to our joint accounts, which I had access to monitor and control. The cars, registered under the trust, every vacation booking, school payment, even their private club memberships, all authorized under my name as co-trustee. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of power returning to me. Not power to hurt or punish, but power to demand the respect I deserved. What are you thinking? Greg asked, watching me carefully. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that it's time for some boundaries. I sat at the grand piano one morning, a week after my meeting with Greg. The house was empty. Alexander at work, the kids at school. My fingers drifted aimlessly over the keys, playing nothing in particular as I looked around the cavernous living room with its soaring ceilings and museum-worthy art. This beautiful prison I had been living in, this place where I was tolerated but never welcomed. I reached for my phone and made 4 decisive calls that would change everything. First, I contacted our bank and froze the black cards. The unlimited credit cards that Isabel and Ethan used without a second thought for shopping sprees, rideshare services, and spontaneous trips with friends. Yes, immediately, I confirmed to the private client manager, and please, notify me of any attempts to use them. Second, I called Marcus, our house manager, and informed him that all household schedules, menu planning, and staff instructions now required my explicit approval. There will be some changes to how things operate around here, I told him calmly. I'll meet with everyone this afternoon to discuss the details. Third, I contacted a locksmith, not the usual service the family used, but one recommended by Greg, and scheduled them to arrive within the hour to replace every exterior lock on the property. Finally, I called Greg. It's time, I said simply. Can you bring the formal notice this evening, around 6? Are you sure about this, Lauren? His voice was concerned but supportive. Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm sure, I replied, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. It's time they understand that respect isn't optional. By the time the children returned from school, the transformation was already underway. New keys sat in my purse. The staff had been briefed, the cards were disabled, and I stood in the entrance hall wearing a tailored navy suit, armor for the battle ahead. Isabel arrived first, breezing through the door with her usual air of entitlement. She barely glanced at me before heading toward the stairs. "Isabel," I called, my voice firm but calm. "We need to talk. Your father will be home soon, and Ethan should be here any minute. Please wait in the living room." She paused, one foot on the first stair, and turned to me with a look of annoyed confusion. Before she could respond, Ethan walked in, his rowing bag slung over his shoulder. "Hey," he mumbled, not looking at me as he headed for the kitchen. "Ethan," I called. "Living room, please. We're having a family meeting as soon as your father arrives." Both teenagers exchanged glances, a silent communication that excluded me as always, before reluctantly moving toward the living room. I could hear their whispered conversation, the occasional laugh that was undoubtedly at my expense. Alexander arrived 20 minutes later, his expression shifting from distraction to concern when he saw me standing formally by the fireplace, the teenager sitting sullenly on the sofa. "What's going on?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. "Is everything okay?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Marcus appeared from the hallway. "Mr. Lang is here, Mrs. Prescott," he announced, his tone carefully neutral. "Please show him in," I replied. Greg entered, professional and composed in his charcoal suit, carrying a leather portfolio. I made the introductions, though Alexander already knew him from our wedding and various legal matters over the years. "Why is your lawyer here, Lauren?" Alexander's voice had an edge to it. "Now," confusion tinged with the first hints of alarm. I gestured for Greg to hand Alexander the folder he was carrying. "These documents will explain everything." As Alexander began to read, the teenagers watched with expressions ranging from confusion to amusement. They clearly thought this was some kind of power play that would ultimately fail. "What is this, Monopoly money?" Ethan joked, looking at his sister. Isabel smirked. "You're seriously trying to act like this is your house?" And Alexander, still scanning the documents with increasing alarm, let out a half-chuckle that contained no humor whatsoever. "Lauren, let's not turn this into some power struggle." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "No, Alex, I'm not turning it into anything. I'm simply enforcing what you already signed." I pointed to the specific clause in the documents. "As of today, I'm executing full trust control as outlined in our agreement." I turned to face all three of them, standing my ground as I continued. "The locks have been changed. The cards are inactive. The drivers, chefs, and staff report to me. You may all remain here respectfully, or you may leave, but this time you will be the ones." Adjusting. Silence engulfed the room. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something that looked almost like respect. That was the moment I realized. They knew. Deep down, they knew I had been mistreated. They knew I had given them grace for years. And now, faced with the consequences of their actions, they had nothing left to say. The first night after my announcement was awkwardly silent. We ate dinner separately. Alexander in his study, the teenagers in their rooms. No one challenged my authority, but no one acknowledged it either. Later that evening, I heard Ethan trying to order sushi delivery using Isabel's secondary card. Denied. Around midnight, through the house notification system, I saw Isabel attempting to book a shopping service for the next day in Manhattan. Denied. Alexander spent the night in the guest room, ostensibly working late but clearly avoiding me. No arguments, no discussion, no apologies. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the house, like the air before a storm breaks, charged with potential energy. The next morning, I came down to breakfast to find Ethan already at the table, picking at a bowl of cereal. He glanced up when I entered, then looked back down at his phone. "The chef wants to know what you want for dinner tonight," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll speak with him," I replied, pouring myself coffee. A moment passed in silence before Ethan spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you want some coffee?" The question was so unexpected, so small, and yet so significant that I nearly dropped my cup. I looked at him, trying to read his expression, but he was studiously avoiding my gaze. "Yes," I said simply. "Thank you." He poured me a cup, sliding it across the table without ceremony. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even particularly warm, but it was acknowledgement. The first genuine acknowledgement I had received in this house in years. Later that day, Isabel knocked on the door of my home office. Another first. "Can I talk to you?" she asked, hovering in the doorway. I gestured for her to enter. She sat perched on the edge of a chair, uncomfortable, but determined. "I need to go to Caroline's birthday party this weekend," she said, her tone carefully modulated to avoid sounding demanding. "It's important." I studied her for a moment. "Important how?" She shifted, unaccustomed to having to explain herself. "Her parents are on the board at Princeton. Dad always says networking matters." At least she was being honest about her motivations. "You'll need transportation and a gift," I observed. "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "Please." That single word hung between us like a fragile thread, the first tentative connection in a new dynamic. "I'll arrange it," I said finally. "Send me the details." She nodded, rising to leave. At the door, she paused. "The dress I wanted to wear is at the dry cleaners," she said, her back to me. "I tried to pick it up yesterday, but the card was declined," I finished for her. She nodded without turning around. "I'll have Marcus pick it up. Today," I told her. She left without another word, but the air felt different somehow. Clearer, as if the first layers of a thick fog were beginning to burn away. Alexander avoided me for 3 days, sleeping in the guest room and leaving for work before I came downstairs. I let him have his space, recognizing that his pride had taken a substantial hit. On the 4th night, I found him in the kitchen at midnight, nursing a glass of bourbon. "We need to talk," he said when I entered. I nodded, taking a seat across from him at the island. "What you did was extreme," he began. "What you allowed was worse," I countered quietly. He flinched, unable to meet my eyes. "I never meant for things to get so out of hand." "But they did, Alex. And you watched it happen." The kitchen clock ticked, loudly in the silence that followed. Alexander stared into his bourbon as if it might offer some escape from this conversation. "I was trying to protect them," he finally said. "After losing their mother." "You weren't protecting them," I interrupted gently. "You were protecting yourself from having to be the bad guy. You let them disrespect me because confronting their behavior was uncomfortable. For you." He looked up, startled by my directness. "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "Isn't it?" I asked. 3 years, Alex. 3 years of me trying to build something with them. 3 years of small cruelties and cold shoulders. 3 years of you saying, give it time, while doing nothing to help that time be productive. His shoulders sagged. The carefully constructed justifications he'd built seemed to crumble before my eyes. I'm not asking to replace their mother, I continued, my voice softening. I've never wanted that. But I do deserve basic respect in my own home, from all of you. Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was wrong, he admitted, the words seemingly painful to express. I let them disrespect you. Because I didn't want to be the bad guy. You had more courage than I did. It wasn't a complete apology, but it was a start. An acknowledgement of truth that we could possibly build upon. What happens now? He asked, looking around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. Now we rebuild, I said simply, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. He nodded slowly. And the legal changes? The trust control? Stays as is for now, I replied firmly. I need everyone to understand that respect isn't optional in this family. It's earned and given, in both directions. Alexander returned to our bedroom that night. We slept on opposite sides of the king-sized bed, a physical manifestation of the emotional distance still between us. But at least we were in the same room, breathing the same air, existing in the same space again. The weeks that followed brought small but significant changes. Ethan began saying good morning when he came down for breakfast. Isabel asked my opinion on a college essay she was writing. Alexander made an effort to include me in family decisions, actively seeking my input rather than merely informing me afterward. None of it was dramatic. There were no tearful apologies or group hugs. The Prescotts weren't built for such overt emotional displays, but the atmosphere in the house gradually shifted from cold tolerance to cautious coexistence. I didn't seek revenge or punishment. I wasn't interested in making them suffer as I had suffered. I wanted only what I had always wanted, to be treated with dignity in my own home. 1 month after the intervention, as I had come to think of it, I began gradually lifting certain restrictions. I reactivated Ethan's card with a reasonable spending limit after he respectfully asked to attend a weekend rowing clinic. I authorized Isabel's shopping account when she presented me with a thoughtful budget for her semester needs. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, in both directions. The real breakthrough came unexpectedly during a charity board meeting for the Children's Hospital. I had been on the board since before meeting Alexander, and Isabel had recently expressed interest in philanthropy. Genuinely, it seemed, not just as a college application booster. I invited her to attend with me, and to my surprise, she accepted. During the meeting, I presented a proposal for expanding the hospital's art therapy program, a project I'd been developing for months. As I fielded questions from other board members, an elderly woman named Margaret Thornton, who had known Alexander's first wife well, referred to me dismissively. "This seems like a lot of money for finger painting," she said with a tight smile. "Wouldn't Eleanor have preferred we focus on medical equipment?" Before I could respond, Isabel spoke up from beside me. "Actually, Mrs. Thornton," she said clearly, "Lauren's proposal includes bringing in professional artists and therapists who specialize in trauma recovery. The research shows significant improvements in recovery rates and mental health outcomes when children have creative outlets during treatment." She paused, then added, "And my mother would have been the first to support anything that helps children heal." The room fell silent. Margaret looked stunned. I was speechless. Isabel had not only defended my proposal, she had aligned it with her mother's values, effectively bridging our worlds in a way I never could have managed alone. As we drove home afterward, I struggled to find the right words to acknowledge what had happened without making too much of it and scaring her back into her shell. "Thank you," I said simply, "for what you said back there." Isabel stared out the window, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. For a moment, I thought she might not respond at all. "She shouldn't have called you that," she finally said. "The second wife, like you're just a replacement part or something." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, afraid to breathe and break this fragile moment. "My mom was amazing," Isabel continued, her voice quiet but steady. "She was warm and funny and smart. She made everyone feel special." She turned to look at me directly. "You're not her. You never will be." I nodded, accepting this truth we both knew. "But," she added, "that doesn't mean you don't deserve respect. What you, did back there, standing up for yourself with us, it was kind of badass." A surprised laugh escaped me. "Badass? Really?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Don't let it go to your head." The car fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Contemplative rather than cold. Shared rather than divisive. When we arrived home, Isabel paused before getting out of the car. "I don't hate you," she said abruptly. "I just want you to know that. I never really did." Before I could respond, she was out of the car and heading into the house, leaving me sitting alone in the driveway with tears blurring my vision. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even particularly warm, but it was honest, and in the Prescott family, honesty was far more valuable than any performance of affection. 2 months after what the family now cautiously referred to as the reset, Alexander approached me with an envelope in his hand. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting beside me on the terrace where I was reviewing client portfolios. "We never really had a proper honeymoon." I looked up, surprised. Our wedding had been followed immediately by a crisis at his company and the promised trip to the Amalfi Coast had been postponed indefinitely, one of many small disappointments I had learned to accept without complaint. "I booked us a weekend," he continued, sliding the envelope toward me. "Just us. No kids, no work, no distractions." Inside was an itinerary for a small luxury hotel in the Berkshires. Not far, but far enough to feel like an escape. The reservation was for the following weekend. "What about the children?" I asked. The old habit of putting everyone else's needs first still strong. "They're almost adults," Alexander replied with a small smile. "They can survive 2 days without us. Besides, Marcus will be here." I studied my husband's face, searching for his motivation. Was this guilt? An attempt to buy back my affection? Or something more genuine? "Why now?" I asked, directly. Alexander considered the question, taking his time before answering. A new behavior for a man who typically had ready responses for everything. "Because I almost lost you," he said finally. "And I'm not sure I would have known what hit me until it was too late." I nodded slowly, accepting his answer and the vulnerability behind it. "I'll pack a bag," I said. The Berkshires in early autumn were breathtaking, rolling hills painted in reds and golds, crisp air scented with wood smoke and fallen leaves. Our hotel was a renovated mansion from the Gilded Age, elegant without being ostentatious. As we checked in, I realized this was the first time Alexander and I had truly been alone together in years. No children, no staff, no social obligations hovering around us. Just two people who had chosen each other once and were now trying to figure out if they would choose each other again. The first evening was awkward. We spoke about safe topics. art exhibitions I was planning, a new investment Alexander was considering, the changing foliage visible from our balcony. We danced around the elephant in the room, neither quite ready to address the fractures in our foundation. After dinner, we walked through the hotel's gardens, following stone paths illuminated by soft lanterns. Alexander took my hand, a simple gesture that felt both familiar and strange after the emotional distance of recent months. "I've been seeing someone," he said suddenly. My heart dropped. I pulled my hand away, stopping on the path. "Not like that," he clarified quickly, turning to face me. "A therapist. I've been seeing a therapist." Relief washed over me, followed by surprise. Alexander had always dismissed therapy as paying strangers to listen to problems you should solve yourself. "Since when?" I asked. "Since the day after you changed the locks," he admitted. "I realized I didn't like the man I saw in your eyes that night. I didn't like who I'd become." We continued walking. The confession, hanging between us like a tender new thing that might either flourish or wither, depending on how we tended it. "My therapist says I've been using the children's grief as an excuse for my own failures," he continued, "that I've been hiding behind their pain instead of helping them through it." I remained silent, allowing him the space to say things he'd clearly been rehearsing. "I never properly grieved Eleanor," he said, naming his first wife for perhaps the first time in our relationship. "I just pushed forward, focused on the kids, on work, on anything but the loss. And then I met you, and you were so alive, so different from the numbness I'd been living in." We reached a small stone bench overlooking a pond. The moon reflected on the still water, creating two perfect orbs, one in the sky, one in the reflection. "But I never did the work," Alexander continued as we sat. "I never addressed my grief, my guilt over not being there when she got sick, my fear of failing as a single parent. I just expected you to fill all the empty spaces without ever acknowledging they existed." I looked at my husband in the moonlight and saw him clearly, perhaps for the first time, not as the confident, capable man who had swept me off my feet, but as someone broken and healing, just as I was. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again," he said, taking my hand once more. "But I can promise I'm trying to be better. For you, for us, for the family we could still become." I squeezed his hand, the first tears I'd allowed myself in months finally falling. "That's all I ever wanted," I whispered, "for us to try. Together." We returned to Greenwich on Sunday evening renewed, not magically healed, but with a cautious optimism that had been absent for too long. Ethan was in the kitchen when we arrived, making a sandwich that appeared to involve every condiment in the refrigerator. "How was your trip?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Good," I replied. "Peaceful. The fall colors are beautiful up there." He nodded, returning to his culinary creation. As I turned to head upstairs with my bag, he spoke again. "Hey, Lauren?" I paused. "Yes?" "I was wondering if you could help me with something," he said, studying his sandwich intently. "My college essay. It's about integrity and, well, I thought you might have some insights." The request hung in the air, between us, an olive branch, humbly extended. "I'd be happy to," I said simply, not wanting to overwhelm the moment with too much emotion. He nodded, relief visible in the relaxing of his shoulders. "Cool, thanks." It wasn't an apology, but in the Prescott household, asking for help was perhaps the closest thing to an admission of wrongdoing, an acknowledgement that I had something valuable to offer. That night, as Alexander and I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. How sometimes the most painful actions were also the most necessary. How boundaries, when properly set, didn't push people away, but rather created the space for genuine connection to form. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked, catching me staring thoughtfully into the middle distance. "Family," I replied, "and how it's built, not born." He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. The following weeks brought more small changes, more tentative steps toward a new normal. Isabel began joining me for coffee on Saturday mornings, not every Saturday, but often enough that it started to feel like a tradition. Ethan asked me to attend his rowing competitions and actually introduced me to his teammates as my stepmom Lauren, rather than the awkward non-introductions of the past. Alexander and I continued to rebuild our relationship, scheduling regular date nights and weekend getaways. He remained in therapy, occasionally sharing insights from his sessions when they pertained to our family dynamic. 6 months after the reset, we gathered in the dining room for a family dinner. Not an unusual occurrence anymore, but still something I cherished. As we passed dishes and discussed our days, I was struck by how different the atmosphere was from those tense, silent meals of the past. "I have something to announce," Alexander said, setting down his wine glass. "I've been thinking about the foundation, and I'd like to create a new position, Director of Arts Programming." He looked at me pointedly. "It would be a perfect fit for someone with extensive knowledge of the art world and strong connections to artists and galleries." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Prescott?" "Only if you're interested, Mrs. Prescott," he replied with a smile. Isabel looked up from her plate. "That's actually a really good idea. Lauren knows everyone in the art world." The casual compliment, the first Isabel had ever given me in front of the family, caught me off guard. "I'd have to think about it," I said carefully. "I have my consulting business to consider." "Of course." Alexander nodded. "It's just something to think about." The conversation moved on to other topics, but the offer lingered in my mind. Not just because of the position itself, which was intriguing, but because of what it represented. Alexander publicly acknowledging my value, creating space for me in a part of his life that had always been separate from our marriage. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed, I found a small box on my pillow. Inside was a key, not to the house, but a vintage-looking skeleton key on a simple silver chain. Alexander appeared in the doorway. "I thought you might like something to replace the house key you've been carrying in your purse," he said quietly. I held up the necklace, questioning. "It's from the original door to this house," he explained. "From when it was built in 1897. I found it in the family archives." I understood the symbolism immediately. A key to the house's past, its history, its foundations. A recognition that I was now part of that lineage. Not an intruder, but a continuation. "It's perfect," I said, fastening it around my neck. Alexander stepped closer, gently touching the key where it rested against my collarbone. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that you never needed legal documents to belong here, but I understand why you needed to use them to be seen." His words brought unexpected tears to my eyes, because he finally understood. This had never been about power or control or punishment. It had been about visibility, about existence, about carving out space in a world that had tried to render me transparent. "Thank you," I whispered, the simple phrase carrying the weight of years of unspoken feelings. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years, the key resting against my skin like a promise, not of ownership, but of belonging. Autumn gave way to winter, and the Prescott household settled into new rhythms. The legal arrangements remained in place, but their presence faded into the background, a foundation rather than a focus. One snowy December evening, I was wrapping Christmas gifts in the library when Isabel appeared in the doorway, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. I nodded, setting aside the silver paper and scissors. "Of course." She entered the room slowly, perching on the edge of an armchair across from me. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap, a gesture so unlike her usual confident demeanor that I immediately sensed the importance of whatever she was about to say. "I've been thinking about what happened," she began. "About how we treated you. How I treated you." I kept my expression neutral, not wanting to interrupt her rare moment of vulnerability with my own reaction. "It wasn't about you," she continued. "Not really. It was about Mom and Dad and—" She took a deep breath. "And about Christine." The name hung in the air between us. Christine, the woman Isabel had mentioned on the phone that day, the conversation that had propelled me to action. "Who was she?" I asked gently. Isabel looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "You don't know?" I shook my head. "Your father never mentioned her." A bitter smile touched Isabel's lips. "Of course he didn't." She settled back in the chair, seemingly having made a decision to tell me everything. After Mom got sick, Dad was a mess. He tried to hide it from us, but we could tell. About a year after she died, he started dating again. Casually at first, then he met Christine. I listened silently, pieces of the puzzle I'd been living with finally coming together. "She was nice enough," Isabel continued. "Younger than Mom. Pretty. She tried with us, kind of like you did. Dad seemed happy." "What happened?" I prompted when she fell silent. "He proposed to her," Isabel said flatly. 2 years after Mom died. We found out because she came to dinner wearing the ring. I tried to imagine the scene. 2 grieving teenagers confronted with their father's decision to remake his life without consulting them. Ethan and I freaked out, she admitted. We said horrible things to both of them. Dad defended her at first, but then what? Then she started changing things. Moving Mom's photos, redecorating rooms, talking about selling the house for something more modern. Isabel's voice hardened. It was like she wanted to erase Mom completely. I nodded, beginning to understand. And your father? He let her do it, Isabel said, the old hurt evident in her voice. He didn't stop her. But when we complained enough, when we made things difficult enough, eventually she left. The engagement was off, and Dad never mentioned her again. The implications of her story settled heavily between us. The children had learned that if they resisted enough, if they made things uncomfortable enough, they could drive away anyone who threatened their status quo. And Alexander had taught them that he would choose their comfort over his own happiness, until he met me and finally stood his ground, however imperfectly. I thought we could do the same thing with you, Isabel admitted quietly. I thought if we were cold enough, difficult enough, eventually you'd leave too. But I didn't, I said softly. No. A small, reluctant smile touched her lips. You changed the locks instead. We shared a moment of unexpected understanding, adversaries who had finally seen each other clearly. I'm not trying to replace your mother, Isabel, I said, voicing the fear that had clearly driven so much of her behavior. I couldn't even if I wanted to. She'll always be your mother, and from everything I've heard, she was extraordinary. Isabel nodded, blinking, rapidly against tears. But I am part of this family now, I continued gently. Not instead of her, but in addition to her memory. There's room for both of us in this house, and in your lives. I know that now, she whispered. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. It wasn't a grand emotional apology with tears and hugs. That wasn't Isabel's style, nor was it mine. But in its quiet sincerity, it meant more than any dramatic gesture could have. Thank you for telling me, I said simply. About Christine, about everything. She nodded, rising from the chair. At the door, she paused. I'm applying to art history programs, she said, not quite looking at me. For college. I thought, maybe you could help me with the applications, since you know people in that world. I smiled, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. I'd be honored. After she left, I sat among the half-wrapped presents, processing what I'd learned. So many pieces finally clicking into place. The children's resistance, Alexander's reluctance to enforce boundaries, the ghost of a failed engagement that had haunted our marriage without my even knowing it existed. That night, I approached Alexander in his study. Isabel told me about Christine, I said without preamble. He looked up sharply, then sighed, setting down his pen. I should have told you myself, he admitted. It wasn't my finest moment. Why didn't you? I asked, taking a seat across from him. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomfort from a man who prided himself on composure. Shame, mostly, he replied honestly. I handled it badly. I let the kids dictate my life. I let a good woman walk away because I was too weak to stand up to teenagers. He met my eyes directly. I didn't want you to know that side of me. But I needed to know, I said quietly. I needed to understand what I was walking into. He nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. You're right. I was trying to protect myself, not you. He paused. Again. The admission hung between us. Not an excuse, but an acknowledgement of a pattern he was finally trying to break. I'm glad you stood your ground with me, he said after a moment. I'm glad you forced us all to face what we were doing. I reached across the desk, taking his hand. Me too. We sat in comfortable silence, the last pieces of tension between us slowly, dissolving in the warm light of truth finally spoken aloud. Spring arrived in Greenwich with a gentle insistence. Crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, trees budding with tentative green. The grounds of the Prescott estate transformed from stark winter geometry to something softer, more forgiving. A year had passed since the reset, and life had found new rhythms that no longer felt fragile or forced. The legal arrangements remained technically in place, though they had become largely symbolic rather than functional. I had reactivated the family cards with reasonable limits, restored normal household operations, and begun the process of restructuring the trust to more fairly reflect our partnership. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. One mild April morning, as I was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new arts initiative, Alexander appeared in my office doorway. Do you have a minute? He asked. I nodded, setting aside my work. Alexander entered, carrying what appeared to be architectural drawings, which he unrolled across my desk. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the plans. I studied them carefully, detailed renderings for a renovation of the east wing of the house, including what was currently a rarely used sitting room adjacent to our bedroom. "You want to remodel?" I asked, confused by his sudden interest in home improvement. "Not exactly," he replied. "I want to create a proper studio for you." I looked more closely at the plans, now seeing what I had missed. The northern exposure windows, the built-in storage for materials, the carefully designed lighting. "A studio?" I echoed, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Alexander nodded. "You mentioned once that you missed painting, that you used to create your own art before you became a consultant." He traced the outline of the proposed space. "This room has the best light in the house. It seems a shame to waste it on furniture no one uses." I was touched by the fact that he had remembered a casual comment made years ago, something I had mentioned in passing during our early dating days, before life had become complicated. "I'd given up on ever having time for my own work," I admitted. "Maybe it's time to reclaim that part of yourself," Alexander suggested. "The foundation position is part-time by design. You could use the other hours however you choose." I studied my husband's face, seeing the genuine desire there to give me something meaningful, not as restitution for past hurts, but as recognition of who I was as a person separate from my roles as wife, stepmother, and professional. "Thank you," I said simply. "It's perfect." Work on the studio began immediately, with completion scheduled for early summer. In the meantime, spring brought other changes to the household. Ethan had been accepted to Dartmouth, his first choice, and approached me one evening with uncharacteristic hesitation. "The rowing team is having a family dinner," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, "to celebrate the seniors who are graduating." I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Dad can't make it. He has that conference in Chicago," Ethan added. "So I was wondering if you would come instead." The invitation, so casually delivered yet so significant, caught me off guard. This would be the first time Ethan had publicly included me in a school event as family. "I'd be honored," I said, keeping my tone matter-of-fact to match his. The dinner was held at a local restaurant, with round tables crowded with parents, siblings, and coaches. As we entered, I braced myself for the awkwardness of explaining who I was, the stepmother, the not-quite parent. But Ethan surprised me, introducing me simply as my mom Lauren to his teammates and their families. Not stepmom, not my dad's wife, just mom. I felt my breath catch but maintained my composure, shaking hands and making small talk as if this moment weren't shattering me in the most beautiful way. Later, as we drove home, I finally found the courage to address it. "You called me Mom tonight," I said quietly, eyes on the road. From the passenger seat, Ethan was silent for so long I thought he might not respond. "Is that okay?" he finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Of course, I wasn't expecting it." Another stretch of silence followed. "You don't have to," I added. "I know I'm not." "You show up," he interrupted. "You've been showing up, even when I was a jerk to you." He stared out the window at the passing streetlights. "That's what moms do, right? They show up." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, afraid that if I spoke, the tears threatening behind my eyes would spill over. "Anyway," he continued awkwardly, "it's easier than saying, 'This is my father's wife, Lauren,' every time I introduce you to someone." I laughed despite myself, grateful for his attempt to lighten the moment. "Practical as always," I teased gently. "That's me," he agreed with a small smile. We drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the new name settling between us, not replacing what had been, but adding to it, expanding our definition of family. Meanwhile, Isabel had decided to defer college for a year, accepting an internship at a prestigious gallery in New York, a position I had helped her secure through my connections, but which she had earned through her own impressive portfolio and interview. "I want to make sure this is really what I want to study," she explained when she announced her decision. Before committing to 4 years of it, I recognized the wisdom in her approach, a thoughtfulness that reminded me of her mother from the stories Alexander had shared. "I think that's incredibly mature," I told her sincerely. She smiled, a genuine expression that still felt new and precious between us. "I thought you might say that." As summer approached, my studio neared completion. The contractors had finished the structural work, and now it was time for the personal touches, selecting furniture, organizing supplies, creating the space where I would hopefully rediscover a part of myself that had been dormant for too long. Alexander had given me complete freedom with the design, but one afternoon I found Isabel standing in the half-finished room, measuring tape in hand. "What are you doing?" I asked, curious. She jumped slightly, startled by my presence. "Oh, I had an idea for a shelving system for your canvases." She showed me a sketch she'd made. Something that would let you see all your works in progress at once without taking up too much floor space. I studied the drawing, thoughtfully designed, surprisingly practical. "It's perfect," I said, genuinely impressed. "Would you help me build it?" She looked up, surprised by the invitation. "Really?" "Really," I confirmed. "We could do it together before you start your internship." The shelving project became a weekend ritual. Isabel and I working side by side, measuring, cutting, sanding, and staining the wood. We talked easily about art, about her upcoming internship, about the gallery world she was about to enter. Sometimes we worked in companionable silence, the rhythmic sounds of our tools filling the space where words weren't needed. On the final day, as we installed the completed shelving system along the northern wall of the studio, Isabel paused, running her hand along the smooth wood. "She would have liked you, you know," she said suddenly. I didn't need to ask who she meant. "Mom was always big on standing your ground," Isabel continued, not looking at me. "She used to say that women are taught to be accommodating, but respect comes from being firm about your boundaries." I smiled, touched by this unexpected connection to a woman I had never met, but whose influence shaped this family I had joined. "She sounds wise," I said softly. Isabel nodded. She was. She finally turned to face me. "I think that's why Dad fell for you. You remind him of her strength, not her looks or anything superficial, just the core of who she was." The observation, so insightful, so unexpected, left me momentarily speechless. "Thank you for telling me that," I finally managed. Isabel shrugged, already moving to pack up our tools, uncomfortable with the emotional weight of the moment. "Anyway, the shelves look good." "They're perfect," I agreed, allowing her the escape from vulnerability. That evening, as Alexander and I walked the perimeter of the property, a ritual we had begun during our reconciliation and maintained as a way to connect at the end of each day, I told him about my conversation with Isabel. "She's right, you know," he said after a thoughtful pause. "You and Eleanor are very different women in many ways, but there's a similar core of principle, of integrity." He squeezed my hand. "It's what I love most about you both." I leaned into his shoulder as we walked, a comfortable silence settling between us. The evening was perfect, warm without being hot, the gardens fragrant with early summer blooms, the setting sun casting everything in a golden glow. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked suddenly. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," I answered truthfully. Not in the simplistic, fairy tale way I might have defined happiness before, but in a deeper sense. I feel rooted here now, seen, respected. I looked up at him. "I belong." He nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. "You've changed. This family, Lauren, for the better." "We've changed each other," I corrected gently. As we completed our circuit of the grounds, returning to the grand house that no longer felt like a beautiful prison but a true home, I reflected on the strange, difficult, wonderful journey that had brought us here. How sometimes you have to risk everything to gain what matters most. How respect isn't inherited by title but earned through action. How family isn't just born but built, deliberately, patiently, lovingly. 2 years after the reset, the Prescott family gathered in the garden to celebrate Alexander's 50th birthday. The event was smaller than the foundation galas of the past, intimate by design, with only close friends and family in attendance. I had organized everything, with Isabel's help during her summer break from college. She had completed her gallery internship and then enrolled at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, where she was thriving, her natural eye for beauty, now supported by growing technical knowledge. Ethan had returned from his freshman year at Dartmouth with new confidence and a declared major in environmental engineering, a field that combined his analytical mind with a newfound passion for sustainability. The garden glowed with the same string lights I had arranged for that fateful fundraiser years ago, but everything else felt different. The air was lighter, the conversations genuine, the laughter unforced. As I moved among the guests, ensuring everyone had what they needed, I caught glimpses of my family, Alexander deep in conversation with his brother, Ethan explaining something with animated hands to his rowing coach, Isabel showing her portfolio to one of my gallery contacts. "You've created something beautiful here," a voice said beside me. I turned to find Margaret Thornton, the elderly board member who had once dismissed me as the second wife, watching me with thoughtful eyes. "The party came together nicely," I agreed politely. "I wasn't talking about the party, dear," she said with surprising gentleness. "I meant the family. You've brought them back to life." Before I could respond, Alexander clinked his glass, calling for everyone's attention. The gathering quieted, faces turning toward him expectantly. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice warm. "Milestone birthdays are meant to be times of reflection, and as I look around at all of you, the people who matter most in my life, I find myself overwhelmed with gratitude." He spoke briefly about friendship, about family, about the journey of the past few years. Then his eyes found mine in the crowd. "But my deepest thanks go to Lauren," he said, extending his hand toward me, "who taught all of us, what it means to love with both compassion and backbone." Gentle laughter rippled through the gathering. "She came into our lives when we were still half broken," he continued, his voice growing more serious. "And instead of running from the mess, she rolled up her sleeves and helped us rebuild. Not by force, not by erasing what came before, but by creating space for something new to grow alongside our memories." I felt tears threatening as I moved to stand beside him, taking his outstretched hand. "To Lauren," he said, raising his glass, "who showed us that family isn't just what you're born into. It's what you choose every day to nurture and protect." "To Lauren," the guests echoed, glasses raised. As the party continued around us, Alexander pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the garden. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small box from his pocket. Inside was a key, not vintage like the one he had given me before, but modern. "What's this?" I asked. "The deed to the house was transferred back to both our names this morning," he explained. "Equal ownership as it should have been from the beginning." I looked up at him, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he replied simply. "The trust, arrangements, the legal maneuvering, we needed all of that to get here, but we don't need it anymore." He closed my fingers around the key. "This house is ours. Truly ours. No games, no power plays, just partnership." I leaned up to kiss him, a deep well of emotion making words impossible. Later that evening, as the party wound down and guests began to depart, I found myself standing in the same spot where Isabel had humiliated me years before. The memory no longer stung. It had transformed into something else, a marker of how far we had all come. Isabel appeared beside me, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. She offered one to me. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. I smiled, accepting the glass. "Just remembering." She nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. "That was the worst version of me," she admitted quietly. "I'm sorry for who I was then." "Don't be," I said sincerely. Without that moment, we might never have found our way here. We stood in companionable silence, sipping our champagne and watching the remaining guests mingle on the lawn. "I have a confession," Isabel said after a moment, her voice taking on a hint of mischief I rarely heard from her. "That night, when you changed the locks and cut the cards," I turned to her, curious. "Part of me was actually impressed," she admitted with a small smile. "It was the first time anyone had ever stood up to us like that. To me." She shook her head slightly, remembering. "We were so awful, and you just refused to accept it anymore. It was kind of badass." I laughed, touched by her honesty. "It was terrifying, actually. I had no idea how it would play out." "Well, it worked," she said simply. "It woke us all up." Across the lawn, I saw Ethan approaching with Alexander, both of them laughing about something. My family, not perfect, not without complications, but real and solid in a way I had once doubted was possible. "Mom!" Ethan called, the name now comfortable and natural on his lips. "Dad's trying to convince me we should get a boat. Please tell him that's ridiculous." "Don't look at me," I replied, holding up my hands in mock surrender. "I'm staying neutral in this one." "Traitor," Ethan grinned, reaching us and immediately launching into his arguments against nautical ownership. As the good-natured debate continued around me, I took a moment to simply absorb the scene, the beautiful garden, the warm evening air. The people I had fought so hard to connect with now connected to me by bonds stronger than legal documents or marriage certificates. The mansion that had once felt like a museum where I didn't belong had transformed into a home. The people who had once been strangers despite sharing my last name had become family in the truest sense of the word. Not because I had forced them to accept me, not because I had won some power struggle, but because I had created the space for authentic relationships to form. Relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or fear. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the children had retired to their rooms, Alexander and I stood on the terrace overlooking the darkened garden. The cleanup could wait. Until morning. This moment of quiet aftermath belonged to us. "Happy birthday," I said, leaning into his embrace. "Thank you for everything," he replied, kissing the top of my head. The party was perfect. I smiled, thinking of how far we had come from that first disastrous fundraiser. It was, wasn't it? We stood in comfortable silence, the distant sounds of nighttime creatures creating a gentle soundtrack to our thoughts. "You know," Alexander said thoughtfully, "when you first took control of everything, the house, the accounts, I was angry, embarrassed. I felt like you had outmaneuvered me somehow." I looked up at him, waiting for him to continue. "But now I realize it was the best thing that could have happened to us," he admitted. "To me, it forced me to see what I had been, allowing what I had been complicit in." He shook his head slightly. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't taken that stand." "I wonder too," I said softly. "I think we would have lost each other," he said with quiet certainty. "Not through divorce necessarily, but through 1,000 tiny surrenders until there was nothing left between us but politeness and regret." The truth of his words settled around us, not painful anymore, but clarifying. "Instead," I offered, "we found each other. Really found each other. Maybe for the first time." He nodded, tightening his arms around me. "I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to demand better. From me, from the kids, from yourself." We stayed on the terrace until the night air grew too cool, then walked hand in hand, back into the house, our house, in every sense that mattered. As we passed through the grand foyer where I had once stood with my lawyer, announcing the changes that would alter our family forever, I paused to look around. The marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the tasteful artwork, all the same as before, yet completely different through the lens of belonging. In the end, the victory wasn't in the legal documents or the changed locks or the frozen credit cards. It wasn't about power or control or even justice. The victory was in the quiet moments. Ethan calling me mom for the first time, Isabel defending me at a board meeting, Alexander finally seeing me as a true partner rather than an addition to his carefully constructed life. The victory was in the family we had become, not despite the difficult journey, but because of it. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't unconditional forgiveness. Sometimes it's unapologetic boundaries. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to shout your truth from the rooftops, but to stand firmly in it, even when no one else believes you should. The Prescott estate was now truly my home. Not because my name was on a deed, but because I had carved out space for myself within its walls and within the hearts of the people who lived there. Not by force, not by demand, but by the quiet, persistent courage to be fully myself and to expect nothing less than the respect that self deserved. That was the greatest victory of all.